More often than not, we think of the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on adults. Many have lost their jobs, their homes, and their sense of stability. However, as we celebrate World Children's Day today, it's important to take note of how these losses have affected children. The lockdown in South Africa has further exacerbated our unequal society and again highlighted the socio-economic disparity and conditions that people live under. Our next guest has worked with children throughout this time and hopes to give us some insight into the plight of children amid the coronavirus pandemic. Pontsho Segwai is World Vision's Advocacy and Child Protection Manager, and she joins us now. Pontsho, good morning to you.
Good morning, Leanne, and good morning to the viewers of Morning Life.
Such a good angle to be taking this morning, to look at what children are going through, because, you know, throughout this lockdown, we've been focusing a lot on adults and obviously on children, but the majority of the focus has been on how it has affected the adult population. What about our little ones? How badly have they been affected?
Wow. Thank you so much for this opportunity. As you said, that today is World Children's Day, and the day is really dedicated to looking at issues around children's rights. And when we look at what the lockdown has done or the COVID pandemic has impacted children, we can see that almost all their rights have been impacted in one way or another. The children's rights are divided into 4 categories. You've got your survival rights. So we have seen in some instances where children just do not even get to live. We've seen a number of children. For instance, we have a program in Orange Farm, and there were a number of children that were killed during this time. Even during the lockdown, we had kids being killed. They have rights to protection, and Childline reported that they had an increased number of calls that were made by children because they were in distress. So we can see even their protection rights were impacted. Their development rights as well were impacted, in the sense that we have seen how schools were closed, and that meant that some of the children that we work with, a lot of our work as World Vision is in the rural areas, and most of those children did not have access to education. So their right to development was impacted during this time because they don't have even access to technology. So we saw the differences with the digital divide. And another right, a group of rights, it's on participation. And today is dedicated specifically to say, let's amplify children's voices. And we saw that during this time, as you were saying, their voices were not really heard as much as we should have listened to their voices. Thanks.
Let's break them down a little bit, because, you know, one thing that we really did talk to, and which was a very tough time for children, and that, of course, was schooling. We saw so many of our young South African children not attending school at all during lockdown. And we talk about this divide, how there are the ones that have and the others that don't have. We've seen many drop out of school, disappearing out of the schooling system, and that we're only going to be getting a proper analysis once the year is actually ended, especially with matrics and the youngsters, and we don't know where they disappear to, and this is a big problem. The other thing is that obviously, as you mentioned, there's that digital divide that so many of our South African children that are at private schools that are in urban areas that were able to access online, carried on schooling, but kids that don't have that, they stopped schooling altogether, and some of them have only been going to school, actually the majority of them, perhaps twice a week. They've fallen right behind, and whether they actually progress to the next grade or in what kind of capacity they go to the next grade is a big question. Are these the kind of things that you're seeing as well?
Definitely, and that's really a key problem or a challenge that we have been seeing. Children are even struggling now with exams coming up because they were not in school and they were not accessing any of the other things that we probably in the urban areas think are easily available. World Vision did try in some of the areas where we work to provide laptops for those communities to do afternoon classes, homework clubs, with the help of corporates like Absa and Nedbank, as well as Standard Bank, supporting our work. So we have realized that it has impacted children. And like you say, we may not see the impact right now, but later on, we know that in terms of development, it has definitely impacted them. Another impact with the school closure is related to issues of food security, because we do know that some children only get a meal when they are at school. Therefore, them not being at school meant that they also went hungry. So we have also tried in some of the areas to distribute food parcels as well.
Yeah. I mean, we remember so vividly the whole issue around the school feeding scheme and how it was taken away during lockdown and children couldn't find that meal that you're talking to that they have every day. I mean, these are memories that are all coming back to us now as we think about it. I mean, we talk about the already glaring socio-economic conditions and disparities that existed before lockdown. How many more children, in your opinion, now, with the plight of their parents, obviously losing jobs, being a part of this bloodbath of job losses in South Africa and a really struggling economy, have now plunged even further into poverty?
Well, I wouldn't have a number at this point in time, but we are part of the South African National Child Rights Coalition as well, Vision. And one of the things that we have been talking about as well was the coalition actually advocated for the increase in the child support grant. And a lot of us are still quite shocked and quite sad that now it is going to be taken away, because we know that that additional grant was quite helpful during the lockdown, and yet we still see that the impact is still there now, and so the need for it to continue still exists. So right now, I wouldn't have the numbers because we haven't looked at, like, done research as yet, but we know for a fact that there are a number of children and families that really don't have any other income except for those social grants that are provided by our government.
Yeah, and that is, I mean, that is real. I mean, we don't expect you to have the numbers, and that's the truth. But I suppose just being there and from your experience, seeing what you're seeing is confirming suspicions. What happens to a child's psyche when one moment they're in a stable home with a stable income, and then the next time they find themselves on the street? What happens to children?
Yes, thank you so much for that question, because I think this is one of the issues that sometimes falls off our agendas. And now with the COVID, it really got highlighted that there is a need to ensure that there's psychosocial support for children. For instance, in the area where we work in Aidujwa, our Mbashe area program, just this year we had 3 children who committed suicide. And these are children within our program that we know about. So there could have been many other children in other areas that committed suicide. We know that obviously the impact has been quite tremendous on children's psychosocial being and their well-being. So it's important that organizations actually also start emphasizing the need for mental health programs and support for children. Because at this time, it's not easy for children. And another key thing is that they're not even able at times to express themselves, to have the opportunity to say, this is what is bothering me, which is why today is important to say, let's listen to the children's voices. Let us allow them spaces to speak so that they don't get to a point where they are so desperate and they end up taking their own lives.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about children, and you mentioned committing suicide, from your experience, what age does this actually start? Many people are thinking, you know, suicide actually affects adults more, or it affects teenagers. But just putting the word children and suicide in the same sentence, what ages are we referring to?
Well, last year we actually had a case of an 8-year-old, so it can start as young as that.
Wow.
Because I think sometimes we forget that children are human beings.
Yeah.
With emotions. So they do experience things probably even more than we do, because at times it's not easy for them, or they're not given the space for expression. So it's important for us to remember that they are human beings. That is why when people talk about child rights, we just need to remind them that child rights are human rights. That's all that it is. So we need to allow them that space to speak, because even as young as 10, they may commit suicide if they feel that they are overwhelmed by their circumstances.
we've spoken about the kind of rights that children have lost during this time of coronavirus, and I know that you, as World Vision, have been quite outspoken about government and not really prioritising the rights. You've outlined which rights exactly, but one of the things I want to also talk about is the discrimination against children, because, I mean, even in the school that I go to, and you know, this is and I do say it, it's a school that have got the resources, but there is still a sense of discrimination against children and parents that perhaps may have contracted coronavirus, and then they come in back into the school environment and they're treated differently. And that's something that we're seeing, and obviously more and more education needs to come around that. But perhaps you can, oh, I don't know if we've lost Pontsho. Pontsho, are you still with us? Looks like we may have lost the link to Pontsho, but we'll try and redial her. But that is a question I know that is vitally important, especially when we talk about the issue of discrimination, and particularly against children in this time. And perhaps when we get Pontsho, we'll be able to just get her views on all of this. But today, all of this in the light of the fact that this is Children Awareness Day. It's Children's Day. It's a day that is set aside to celebrate the children of not only South Africa, but of the world as well. And you know, sometimes we almost do forget in this time. You know, Sakina, we've been so wrapped up in our own thoughts and our own problems that, you know, in and amongst that, children. And one thing that we have sort of not focused too much on is also the mental anguish that kids have been through at this time. It's been a very, very hard time for children. It really, really has been.
Very hard.
Yeah.
And as you say, I suppose human nature in some way, whereby you're so engrossed in your own problems.
Yeah.
And as a parent, having to provide and take care of all of these things, that you forget that your children are also going through something.
So true. You may see them playing happily outside, but you actually don't know what's going on in their minds. Pontsho's back on the conversation. I'm so glad we managed to get you back in. I mean, Sakina and I just talking about the issues. But I want to, as you dropped off the line, we were talking about the discrimination that some kids may be going through at this time. Talk to us about this and the discrimination in the communities that you work.
Yes, this is an issue that is really coming up around stigma. I believe that we should have learned from our experiences of HIV and AIDS. But unfortunately, whenever there is something new, it brings in emotions in other people and makes them then sometimes not to act very well towards other people. And so we have heard comments, and we have heard the more that people are getting infected and having to be reintegrated back into society. We have had some stories where people are being discriminated. And with children so far, we have not had reports in our own areas where we are working. And it's because what we have said, even with our work with UNICEF, we are doing some work on risk communication and community engagement. We have identified issues of stigma is key, and it's important for us to also be aware of the kind of language that we use when talking about people that have been infected. And going into the festive season now, with more people coming up and telling their stories, we have said we want to use the opportunity to get more people, including children. For instance, now we have a program that we are doing in Nelson Mandela Bay, because we know that right now it is a hotspot. We are working together with UNICEF, and we want to use that opportunity to say, come tell your story. Come and share your experience of having been positive, what it was like, so that, because sometimes we fear what we do not know. So if people can hear that, Pontsho, like for instance, myself as well, I did test positive. Okay, and it was difficult at the time. But fortunately for me, so far, I have not experienced any sort of discrimination against me. But we know that there are real concerns, and there are people who have been discriminated, including children as well.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it is something. And as you say, it's an education thing that we need to talk to people about. I mean, you get it, and you do get better. You get over being that, you know, what is the word I'm looking for? That you can actually pick it up from the other person. My English is not working for me today, but if, you know, that is the thing, that you're not contagious anymore, is that you do have it, you get over it, and that's when you can get on with normal life. So, and that's a big education drive that we need to embark on, and these are the after effects of coronavirus. I think it's being sort of focusing in on what happens at the time, but it's what happens afterwards that we really need to worry about. Just finally, as we start wrapping up and we talk about the children of South Africa in particular, what is the message on this World Children's Day? I mean, if we have to talk to people, decision makers, what is it that you would like to see changing in this time? Because we haven't even touched on the abuse of children, because that is something that unfortunately, again, during this time had increased, whether it be the abuse of women and children or any partner being abused. Because of the lockdown, there was nowhere to run and abuse was rife. Perhaps you want to give us a message at this time.
The key message for today is really around also amplifying the voices of children. Let's allow the children to speak to us. Like even right now, I even think I should not be the one who is here. It should be a child telling their own story in their own words. So we need even our decision makers to listen to the voices of children, because children are active agents. There are ways that we can engage them, bring them to the table. We know that, for instance, this year the Children's Parliament could not function because of the lockdown and COVID. But we want to create more spaces for children to be heard, for our government to take their, and not only as tokenism. You know, sometimes, Leanne, we get to a point where we just bring children to the table and say they were here and it's numbers. But it's not about that. It's about ensuring that whatever recommendations that they make are actually taken into consideration, and making sure that as we hear their voices, we ensure that they are protected. You raised an important issue around the violence against children. We have a campaign, we call it Takes a World to End Violence Against Children. And that means each one of us have a role to play. It's not only government, it's each one of us understanding what it is that we can do to ensure that children are protected, including children themselves. So they are at the center of their development. Let's see them as agents of change. Let's understand that they know what it is that can be done to help them to develop them. So let's allow their voices to be heard. Thanks.
Pontsho, thank you. Thanks so much for talking to us this morning. Pontsho Segwai is World Vision Advocacy and Child Protection Manager, talking to us about the plight of children and their rights amid the coronavirus pandemic. Today is World Children's Day, and we celebrate and pay special attention and respect to our children.